Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to wait a few seconds as folks enter the room. If you would like to throw into the chat box where you're from, where you're joining us from, maybe why you're here, or where you heard about this tonight, and give us a few more moments and we'll begin. All right. So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Amelia. I'm a staff member with the New York State chapter of NASW, and I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight. I have a few administrative announcements very quickly, and then we'll get on to the most important part of this evening. So first, I want to mention that this is a chapter chat, which means it is not a continuing education program. This does not hold CE credit, but I will put a link into the chat box so you can check out the upcoming CE programs. I also just want to ask that everyone stay muted while the panelists are speaking to cut down on that background noise. Of course, there will be a time that we want to discuss. We want to hear your voice, but during the conversation, please stay muted and just use that chat box to make a comment or to ask any questions. Beyond that, I am going to throw it quickly right over to Rox. I want to thank Rox for all the hard work that they put into coordinating this program. It's a part, as a part of their MSW internship and now as an awesome colleague. So thank you so much, Rox.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. So my name is Rox. Well, my name is Tatiana, but folks call me Rox. I use she, they pronouns. As Amelia was saying, I previously was an intern at the office, and now I'm the communication assistant, which just means if you receive emails and things of that nature, I probably am the one who crafted that or sent that to you, and running things social media related. So kind of the idea for this panel was just getting a chance to share with folks what it's like to be queer in social work and what that experience is like. And I thought, who better than other queer social workers who are doing this? I tried really hard to get not only a vastness in like gender and sexuality, but also a vastness in like where each person holds, what each person is interested in, to show that like if there are similarities in experiences, it's because this is the queer experience, or like it can be related to that. And that also each of us are very unique. So if someone has something to share, that's not invalidating to that being a queer experience if others don't share that as well. But I'm hoping that everyone can learn something, get a chance to listen. There will be 5 questions that we'll go through just to get a chance to know everyone, their experience, what it's been like. And then we also will have time for Q&A at the end. And yeah, so if you do have a question, feel free to like type it in the chat directly to me. So then I can just kind of keep note of that. And then I'll go through and like read those. And if folks, any of the panelists want to answer, then we will open it up to them. So we're first going to do some introductions. So if the panelists could share, starting with Eddie, name, pronouns, if you want to share gender, sexuality, please do, and kind of what you're doing, where you're at in social work right now.
So good evening, everybody. My name is Eddie. I use he, they pronouns. I identify as being a queer solosexual male. For those who don't know what solosexuality is, it means that I prefer masturbatory sex over penetrative sex. Let me see, where am I in my social work journey? So straight out of grad school, I graduated a year ago. I started a holistic therapy practice. I got my license. I really didn't want to work for other individuals simply because of the stress and trauma of navigating a capitalist society as a queer person, as a brown person, as an Indigenous person. So took the leap, and here I am today, happily, radically sharing this authentic truth with all of you.
Thank you, Eddie. Anna, would you mind going next? Oh.
Sure. Yeah, that is a very hard introduction to follow. Some incredible panelists here. Hi, my name is Anna. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a cisgender woman who is panromantic demisexual, but that's a lot of words that people don't always understand. So I typically just say I'm queer. as far as where I'm at in my social work journey, I am going to be a third year BSW student. So baby social worker.
Thank you. Sully, I saw that you're unmuted. You want to go next?
I was just ready. Sorry. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. Happy Pride. My name is Soeli. I use they, he pronouns. I identify as pansexual or just in general queer, because some people, there's still the debate between pansexual, bisexual. So in general queer, gender apathetic, all those things. I just recently graduated in May, so I'm like brand new social worker. Currently, I work with folks living with fibromyalgia.
Thank you. And then Mickey, would you mind going?
Hello, everyone. My name is Mickey, pronouns he, him. I am a homosexual, queer, cisgender man. I have been a therapist for about 12 years, a social worker for 5. And I am 2 years into my license, and I am based out in California and with a specialty in youth. Yeah, let's say that. Yes.
Thank you. So these are our panelists. There possibly might be another one joining us, and if she does, I'll give her a second to introduce herself, and then we'll continue. But for now, kind of the next question that I wanted to hear from the panelists, it just relate to your experience as a queer social worker, what that's been like through education system, your career, and please feel free to share the good, the bad, the ugly, all the in-betweens. And we'll start with Soeli for that.
I wish there was more good that I could say. I think that I'm the type of person who likes going up to like different institutions with like a sledgehammer and just knocking all the stuff down and saying that all of this is wrong. And I think that a lot of that comes from the curriculum. Unfortunately for me, what I found I was missing so much was LGBT curriculum. It wasn't until I didn't get my BSW. I only got my MSW, so only 2 years to be fair. But it wasn't until I took a LGBT policy class that I ever talked about anything related to gender and sexuality within a classroom. And by default, it would happen in that classroom because of the title. And something that I found lacking was I had friends who wouldn't understand what homosexual sex was and what that meant and why is that different and why do you have to make sure that you know about those different things so that you can have those conversations with your clients, right? I had friends who didn't understand pronouns, even though, you know, I'm obviously a person who does not use pronouns as I appear, right? In terms of societal norms. And I just think that one of the biggest things for me was curriculum did not match what's going on in the world. And it's really unfortunate because you are now baking a set of social workers who are going to go out into the world and have to relearn and re-understand, and also unfortunately re-traumatize a lot of the service receivers because they just don't know what it is they're supposed to know outside of just perhaps pronouns.
Yeah, thank you. You brought up a ton of good points and how the education system often I've found is lacking in teaching, whether that's intentional or not intentional. It still leaves a ton of social workers that can be ignorant if you're in, and sometimes, or like not in, and even sometimes in the community of being queer, like you still don't know everything and you still could learn more. And sometimes that just is lacking as like queer social workers. Anna?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Soil said about curriculum and there really being a lacking of education of just like queer competent education, which is so important in a profession like social work, especially like when you think about like, okay, if we are providing services often to the most marginalized communities, and who is a marginalized community that needs services queer people, queer youth, like that is a big issue. And yet, like I took human behavior classes where we're talking about, like development and sexual development and things in a very like incredibly binary sense of like, okay, this is what men go through, this is what boys go through, this is what girls go through. And in an incredibly binary sense that, yeah, you're just kind of sending social work students out into the workforce with this incredibly lacking education, and they're not equipped to handle these kinds of diverse issues. And I think especially in some spaces, something that I experienced is that there's also just not this understanding that like when we're talking about other people or when we're talking about these concepts of sexuality, that we also could, that they could be professors could be talking about people in the room who identify that way. It's that people, that us as social workers, we're not just talking about like, I mean, people aren't abstract as is, but it's also like there are people in that room with lived experiences. And so when teachers are kind of like, I remember this one class period where a professor was explaining different LGBTQIA identities. And she said, when she was explaining asexuality, which is that umbrella that I fall under, she's like, yeah, I know it's hard to believe that people like that exist, people who don't want to have sex, but they exist. And I'm just sitting there like, this is a social justice class. Like, and so I think there also needs to be more compassion because, yeah, of what like Swelly was saying about traumatizing, about that education being traumatizing for people who occupy those identities.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. You brought up such a good point of like the lack of normalization of the queer like identities, that like a professor would even say like, I know it's surprising. It's like, actually there's like a ton of people that this is not surprising for, who are in community like with each other and like in spaces, that this is not surprising. It only is triggering because like we don't talk about it. So then you're made to feel othered and like you don't really fit in these spaces, and like experiences like that typically don't help. Eddie?
Yeah, I'll say for me, and this I think carries from academic spaces into the actual field, but I think it is the terrible programming that queer people are kind of needs only aligned with sexual deviance or like HIV, STIs. I can remember sitting in classes and, you know, queer people were always used as a litmus test to say, well, what if you have to work with someone who's gay, and if they have HIV, or if they're a pedophile? And it's like you throw all those all into one kind of structure as if this is all that we are. And even transitioning out of academic spaces, you know, I recently did a presentation and it was only presented to me to do something about prevention. Queer people prevention and the health inequities between BBI-POC folks and their white counterparts. Because I understand that the way that so many people in society see LGBT folks as being sexual, like dysfunctional social issues only, I decided to present on race-induced stress and trauma, sexual trauma, and also a higher incidences of Alzheimer's with unprocessed like needs that are not going to be met. And at the end of that presentation, the social worker who was the director of the site asked, well, how is this relevant when it comes to prevention? And I asked her and I said, do you only see LGBT people as being an HIV issue? Because we have way more issues than just that. So I think that as we, as a profession, are uplifting and normalizing queer issues, right? We have to see us through the lens of what is happening today. And while yes, queer people do have higher rates of infection when it comes to HIV and STIs, when we look at the raw numbers, those who are the most impacted are cis Black women. And even when we talk about PrEP and PEP access and prevention, Black women are not getting this information. So we have to see where we are falling in gaps. And even when it comes to testing, I know one of the answers and questions on the licensing exam looks at HIV, and it's completely skewed information. And it goes based off of this logic of the 80s, and it's just not true.
Thank you, Eddie. Again, just another big point of like often what's associated with being queer are negative labels. And then we are expected to kind of like figure that out. Like the person asking, like, what does that have to do with prevention? And it's like, do you know that there's like 10 million other things that are being faced? And like, we need to talk about those things too. Mickey.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I'm noticing, and that's a pattern, that's a sad pattern, is that we all went to different schools and had very similar experiences about this education system that is missing in so many of these ways. I have one of my strongest memories from grad school was a teacher who had 50 years of social work experience, messing up the letters of the LGBTQIA, and then just like laughing about it in front of the entire class, which was really triggering for me and the one other queer student that was in the class, to the point where I got a bit activated and spoke up. Initially in a way that maybe was not the best. However, I was able to regulate myself quick enough to where the professor was like, oh, if you think that you can teach it, you feel free to. And I was like, gladly, and walked up to the board and started to give part of this lecture with the help of my other queer student, which was a lot of pressure, should not have been my role. I was there to learn as a grad school student. That is not my job in this space. However, I would rather give a go at it as someone with lived experience than have all this false information going out to all of my colleagues, friends, and other folks that are in that class. And I will say, though, that even though that was a negative experience initially, I at least respect the teacher for turning it into a positive experience overall, because after that class, they were much more aware of lived experiences for everything that they taught moving forward. And at every class moving forward, they would always ask, oh, did I get anything wrong? Am I missing anything? Would anyone like anything to contribute at the beginning of class, at the end of class? And it created an entirely different learning environment for myself and my peers, which is much more encouraging and empowering. But unfortunately, that came from a place of hurt. That came from a start off of not the best place, where I shouldn't have had to go through that. But that was the trajectory of that classroom's dynamics. Even though this person had 50 years of experience of social work on top of what they were doing as a teacher. And I would say professionally, I've noticed that most of my colleagues in the social work world, their understanding does not go past pronouns. And even their understanding of pronouns is very limited. So I find myself oftentimes getting emails and texts from folks being like, hey, I have a student who identifies this way, give me information. Hey, I have a student who's telling me this in session. What can you help me with this? All following confidentiality, of course, but just asking for questions about queer identity, gender expression, all of these various dynamics that incorporate a part of our lived experience. And while I'm glad to help in many circumstances, that's another burden that I have to carry on top of my own caseload, on top of my own day-to-day life and experiences. So yes, I think it'd be great if we could have an education system and even a professional system that set folks up with more information that is actually helpful and applicable as soon as they graduate, right out the gate.
Yeah, no, so many good points brought up. And it sounds like there's always this dichotomy of like, this burden shouldn't be mine. I'm paying you to teach me. However, if I don't take up, then who? You're left to teach this, and it's not going well already. So it's like this feeling of like, I don't want to have to teach this class, or I don't want to have to teach this person or spend extra time to do these things. And like, sometimes it's fine. Sometimes it's like, at least for me, like it can be fun to teach someone and like watch them be enlightened. But like when it becomes like an every day, every week, every queer student you run into, like you have to learn at some point how to like handle this on your own, and like what is the best way to be going about this. So yeah, just definitely is one of the points that felt noteworthy, which kind of brings me to kind of our next question of wondering like, what did you do to like help you navigate through the system, like while you're in school, while you're in these spaces, in these classes with these colleagues? Yeah, that kind of just helped you as like a queer person. And I think Mickey, you're starting us off.
For me, it was finding other queer folks in the community, like finding other folks for me to connect with through organizations that were on campus, through one of the benefits of social media is that it connects you with folks all over the country or in the world who have similar experiences potentially as you. So reaching out and just Googling organizations and things. I will say that I appreciated my university for making us aware of a lot of things that were out there. So they're like, even though they may have been a little bit more hands-off than I would have liked as far as helping us to figure those things out, they at least presented the information to be like, hey, here are some things if you would like to connect with some folks. So that at least that first step I appreciated in helping me to connect with folks who understood so many of the things that I was going through without me having to give all of this background and all this explanation that may or may not land well with them, or that way potentially require even more explanation, which would be even more draining to me, who is already feeling drained by whatever the negative experience I was having was in the moment.
Thank you. Sounds like community was like a big element that kept you going. Did any other panelists have tips or tricks on how they kind of navigated the profession? Eddie?
Yeah, so I'll give my piece. I'm going to give you the trigger warning first, because what I'm going to say is going to trigger some folks. So when I grew up queer, okay, and I'm not even that, much in age, I'm only 33, so I'm still relatively young. But my experience in queer life is not what it is today. Just in seeing like the transition of representation on TV, a lot of young folks are living in an age that queerness is so centered in such a positive way. And while there's still so much work to go, it was something that I did not have. And the one thing that honestly made me successful in navigating these spaces is fighting through a lot of those really uncomfortable, oppressive places. And I think that for folks who are queer and who are younger in this space, like we have to really manage our expectations. We're not going to get 100% of all of our needs met. And that's just a reality. And while you're balancing that, understanding that it's Pride Month, and Pride started as a riot, violent riot at that. Everything we have, we physically fought for. And what my fear for a lot of queer folks coming after is a hypersensitivity and fragility that if something does not get given to them in the way that they want it, everything just collapses underneath that. There's no foundation or structure. And so while we don't want a world that is full of hate and institutional violence and bullying and all those things, we also have to recognize that our identity is something that is rooted in so much power and strength and resistance. And that resistance will always carry forward. But it was those really difficult things that tried to break me as a queer person that catapulted me to where I am today. And so I think that managing your expectations and remembering the four folk who came before us, who physically fought to get to where we're at, and remembering that there's a lot of privilege, right? That young folks who are queer have today that we did not have. And, I saw a comment earlier about intergenerational communication. A lot of our queer elders grew up never seeing a queer person at all, like literally being arrested if they were in drag or whatever the case may be. And so when I see my queer elders who see me being more out and proud in my queerness and they're uncomfortable with that, I have to give them respect and empathy because they didn't have that. This is how they were socialized. And even me, I'm only 33, but I see younger queer folk who are way more radical than I am. And I'm like, oh man, this is a little triggering. This is a little uncomfortable for me. But we all are going to go through that cycle of like aging out of our radicalism because the ones after us, they got something coming. And the young ones in the room, there's going to be the ones after you who got something way more. So I think that we all have to just give grace and understand that like, we're not going to get 100%. That's all.
No, thanks for sharing. Definitely like the piece of like having grace and empathy for kind of the intergenerational experience, like queer experience of how the older generation didn't have what, like maybe the in-between generations experiencing versus the millennials versus Gen Z versus, whatever it is. And like, how do you share this common space with other folks? So thank you for that, Swelly.
Eddie, I loved everything you just said. I do want to push back just a little bit on the point of on the point of like managing expectations. I feel like when we get into a space of, well, be happy you got this, be happy you got that, then we end up being happy with crumbs versus breaking things down and building our own tables, right? I think that oftentimes that is the line where the intergenerational conversations sort of happen, right? Like exactly like you said, a lot of folks who are older have not been able to see, like would not imagine seeing Pride in almost every borough, having a national Pride before the pandemic happened. I was at World Pride and I was astounded, but I also was in the back with an agency that actually did LGBT work versus Chase and American Express being in the front, right? And I think that when we kind of try to box ourselves into, at least we've gotten this far, we sometimes forget how much further we have to go and then end up creating that division. That's the only thing I had, but I loved everything that you said.
Yeah, no, you also like bring up good points of like, that I think Eddie brought up the point of like the next generation is going to come typically more radical than the previous one. And that is because what they got was different than what the previous generation got. So like right now we're experiencing so much of like more equality than what the previous generation has experienced, more representation, more this, more that. Which allows the next generation to come that didn't get the experience of not being able to be out, to be more radical when they don't receive the things that they're like, okay, yes, I can be out, but like, why is it if two people kiss in a movie that are the same sex or whatever it is, like, that's deemed down upon, where like some of the older generation might be like, I'm just happy I can like hold my partner's hand outside and like, amen, like I'm glad, like I've been wanting to do this for years, like I've been hiding and whatever it is. So yeah, I just thought you brought up a good point. Eddie,
If I could, yeah, just a little piggyback, because I think, and everything you said, Soeli, is so important because it comes down to language too, right? Mm-hmm. The language that folks will give us that may trigger something in us. And I think that if we hold the mirror back at ourselves, that's the shadow work that we have to do. As queer folks, not everybody's going to have the language that gives us what we need, what our spirit needs. And without doing that shadow work and that internal healing, Audre Lorde said it best, we're destined to perpetuate the same kinds of oppressions that have been put onto us. And so I think as we navigate, again, this tightrope, are we fighting for liberation? Are we fighting for privilege? When do these two things intersect? When am I triggered? When am I not? How do I handle myself in the face of this oppression? Because it is the oppressed to liberate the oppressors. And we know that even within our own community, right? Trans folks, they're the most oppressed even within our own community. So yes, to your point, absolutely.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what all of you have said is just so important. And it also just really shows like how we can hold space for these opposing dialects, for like this simultaneous truth of we have come so far, and queer folks have so many just like freedoms or privileges that older queer folks didn't have, and yet we have so far to go. And like to add on to that, I also want to add, like, I was hearing like Eddie, when you were talking about this idea of like just fighting and fighting for our identity and for equity and for an inclusion, to also add on to that I think that sometimes it can get like a little bit carried away and into putting almost this degree of responsibility on queer folks of like, of they have to always show up, they have to always be fighting, because I mean, we know as queer folks that when we're entering into these spaces, a lot of times we're just kind of always on, we're always always ready to correct that professor or speak up or say something. And because a lot of times in those spaces we're the only ones willing to do that, but to also like hold that and hold that like this idea that like if we're not going to do it, like no one else is, and we've got and we have strength in this community and can fight for that, and simultaneously that we're free to leave those institutions and those places that aren't serving us, and that it's not our responsibility to stay there. It's not our responsibility to change institutions. It's not our responsibility to continue to subject ourselves to that trauma just for the sake of changing it, because we don't think anyone else will. Because I think there is also, particularly in educational institutions, there is power in leaving as well. And I mean that like money is essentially in the way our society is set up, like money is our students' voice. Like to administration, students are kind of just dollar signs. And so sometimes that is a form of doing something. And because I think like through my experience, have seen a lot of students who just feel like they're like, I don't want to leave the space because I feel like I have to do something about it. I feel like I have to change it. But it's like, sometimes you can say like, hey, this is not something that we're directing our money towards. This is not something that like I am making my statement by leaving it. And it doesn't even have to be like I'm doing this to make a statement. It can be I'm doing this because it's not serving me and because I deserve better. And, I deserve to be in a space that like, hey, it might not be perfect, but if a space does not hold any respect for you, then you deserve better than that. And it's not your responsibility to stay in a space and fix it.
Thank you. I wanted to give a chance if any panelists wanted to comment on just like anything that's been said before I share thoughts or move. But in the meantime, Anna, I think I appreciate what you said, because also like it's so valid that like sometimes we're expected to fight in this until we literally can't see straight, until like we're passed out, tired, drained, and like giving up. And like activist burnout is so real. Like, and next thing you know, you've this, like it's something that's like currently being studied more, is that you have these turnover in organizations and movements and all these things. And when you, like you have to push yourself to like keep going and keep fighting, but you're also like going against the system, it is so much harder to push your organization forward and like keep going and keep the mission, keep the vision, keep whatever it is, when the turnover can be so high, because we are taught like, no, keep going, keep fighting for this or whatever it is. And it kind of just reminds me, I was in one of my classes and it's a mixed generation, and one of the professor was posing like, it's, the studies are showing that like people are starting to not be social workers anymore. People are starting to not be in like the helping field in general, like so psychologists, psychiatrists, whatever it is. And they're starting to do other things. They're like, I'm tired, I'm out, like I don't want to do it. And a student like raised their hand and they're saying, well, like the older generation is tired. And so like if the current generation is not doing it, who's going to do it? And it kind of made me think like about the aspect of community. Like, I don't know if we all need to be doing something at the same time, but like if we at least held each other in the same space and like tried to at least be in community with one another. So that was something that was coming up for me as like kind of y'all were speaking. And to your last point, Anna, Eddie, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I want to say, because Anna, you brought up something that was, important. It's like a space may not be perfect. And I think that we have to remember that perfection does not exist in any way, form, or fashion. And when we expect perfection, we are going to be led down the path of disappointment. Because while we are all here celebrating Pride and we are all celebrating our queerness, we also have to remember that at the center of intersectional oppression is race. And even within our own queer spaces, Black and brown queer people do not get treated at all in the same way that our white counterparts do. And so, so Ellie, when you had talked about the crumbs, right? Let's take that out of a queer context and put that into a racial context. It gets even worse. It gets even worse, right? And, I think that, with what you said about, the crumbs that were given, managing expectation, doing internal shadow work, determining whether we're fighting for liberation or fighting for privilege, we are really in this hotbed of, I feel like, a constant identity crisis for all of us, right? Am I queer enough? Am I Black enough? Am I Indigenous enough? What's my proximity to whiteness? What is this? What is this? We are constantly in this place of higher consciousness. And for many Black and brown people, we have had to have that either way. And at the same time, because of colorism and pigmentocracy, we are also being forced to reflect on our phenotypic experiences as well. I may be lighter than you, so that comes with privilege. Hair texture, nose shape, right? All of these things, race, class. And I was gonna kind of save this comment for like the next question, but I think it's appropriate to put it here. One thing that has helped me also navigate in this is understanding when institutions, because we talked about like high turnover, but when these institutions are pinkwashing for the sake of appearing to be progressive, right? Like I saw in the comments, talking about the commercialization of like pride. So many institutions are like pinkwashing and be like, yeah, we're progressive, we support queer people, even within the NASW. We're progressive, we love queers. Okay, great. But y'all don't love Black people. Not to the degree that you want that liberation. So I think that it's so important that we constantly hold that mirror and reflect onto ourselves, what utopia we want. Are we ever going to get it? No, because somebody's going to feel upset about something. And we, I think, have to imagine at a greater context above ourselves, what the closest thing to a reciprocal, peaceful, loving society looks like. Right.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie. Just brought up the important point of like the intersectionality of issues. So like, yes, this is a panel that talks about like queerness, but even in that, like we all have a different experience of like me being a darker shade, someone else being lighter, someone being white, someone being like class and this, that, and the other, and how that like exponentially changes the way you experience queerness in itself too. Because every queer space is not safe for fill in the blank. For every disabled person can't enter into a queer space and it be accepted because people have ableism and like issues with that. And like, so yeah, it definitely is and can get so complex to talk about the queer experience, because often it is beyond that. It is more than that. And sometimes we start here, but it really does encompass a lot. Which kind of brings us to our next question, which Anna, you're starting us off of, like, what would you change about the profession for the benefit of the queer community? And I can imagine that this list might be extensive, or you have a few things. So please feel free to share and jump off each other and things of that nature. But I'll pass it off to Anna.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, from my own experience, I'm a BSW student, so obviously I don't have as much experience with the professional side, but I mean, I think that changing that educational side of it is important because it starts with education, and I think, and you can't see the meaningful change that we need to see in the profession without a meaningful change in that education as well. So yeah, I think that is one of those like fundamental areas that that needs change. And yeah, I like to echo what Eddie was saying. I mean, like that is intersectionality and the like understanding of how marginalization affects other marginalization and is impacted by areas of privilege, and how I mean, I think like I did get a solid amount of that maybe in my BSW program, but not nearly to the degree that it needs to be happening, because I think that a lot of times professors will try and break courses into, we're going to talk about just race here, or we're going to just talk about sexuality or gender identity here. And obviously it's an easier way of teaching it maybe, but it doesn't give that complete picture when you're not introducing other aspects. And so identity is just this one complicated, messy web, and you can't disentangle any part from it. You can't talk about queerness without talking about straight presenting privilege, without talking about able-bodied privilege, without talking about like skin color privilege, white privilege. Like you can't talk about any one of those things without the other. And I think an additional like aspect of that is that I think this is okay. I'm trying to think about how to phrase this. I come from an evangelical university, a Christian evangelical university background, which obviously has which was very contentious when it came to LGBTQIA plus identities. And I think that is a huge area that it needs to change, because I think in a lot of ways, we try and be really respectful of different perspectives and different places and different lived experiences that people are coming from. And that is incredibly important. And at the same time, we also cannot be excusing those things. We cannot be excusing active trauma that is happening in the name of those differences. And I think that because you cannot be a social worker and say, oh, I'm a social worker and I will serve XYZ populations, but like, I don't believe that LGBTQIA plus people are valid. That I think that is, and maybe that's controversial, but that is diametrically opposed to the values of social work. And just like that thing with identities, you cannot disentangle any part of it. You can't say, I'm just going to ignore this piece. You can't say, I'm just going to, because that you automatically cut out a huge population of clients who you can't just ignore that aspect, because every part of their identity is interconnected with another. And so you can't just cut out that part. And so I think that honestly, that is like Soeli was saying earlier about wanting to take a sledgehammer to systems. That is honestly one of the ones that I think needs to be addressed, is how it is, is how we kind of dance around this idea of we can ignore this population of people. Because I think that is just fundamentally opposed to the values of social work.
It looks like Rox's Wi-Fi might have gone off, but I'm just gonna have Mickey just keep this conversation rolling.
Thank you for all those amazing things that you said, Anna. I am right there with you in so many aspects. I think that people love to pick up the hot topic of the day, the category of the day, the identity of the day to latch on to and pretend like the others don't exist. As someone who works a lot with youth, I see oftentimes that people love to put folks in these boxes of, oh, we're going to only help the boys do this. We're going to only help the girls do this, forgetting that there are so many identities that are entangled with all those identities that they think that they're singling out. And then they end up doing a big disservice to these folks as they tell them, oh, no, this is the way that this information is going to be presented. This is the way that we're going to support you, not considering all the other parts, that the ways that they might be unintentionally doing harm by ignoring the other parts of these folks' identity. And I'm specifically, in this case, specifically talking about helping profession folks, educators, social workers, all these folks who occasionally put overemphasis on specific identities without considering all the other aspects that might go into those identities themselves. The other aspect of this question that I wanted to poke in on was, again, agreeing with you on the curriculum, because I feel like as somebody who has been 2 years into their license and who's about to, who just finished actually all of their stuff to renew their license, one of the requirements is 7 hours of HIV education. Like, that's the only part of queer identity that's important for social workers to be updated on when it's time for them to hit the 2-year mark. Like, why are there not other options for queer identities that folks could get just that same 7 hours of credit that are just as important for them to learn about identities and things other than the association with sexually transmitted infections and things of that sort? Like, what does that perpetuate in our own community of social workers that we're overly emphasizing that, oh yeah, the only thing you need to know about the queer community is HIV and STIs. That's it. Moving on, you're great. Yeah, you're licensed, do whatever you want. It's like, no, like, there's so many aspects of this community that folks need to learn about on a regular basis and keep updated on to stay aware of. But if that's all that we're teaching folks, if that's all that we're emphasizing, then folks aren't getting the education that they deserve. And the recipients, more importantly, the community isn't getting the help and that they deserve. Because now we have a bunch of social workers who have limited information, who are now thinking that they're doing they might be helping folks when they might be unintentionally or maybe even intentionally causing harm to folks. Because let's be real, there's some folks out there who intentionally cause harm and may not want to admit it. It's not something that we want to deal with, and calling those folks out is one of the biggest things that I know that I've had an issue with in my career as a social worker, of seeing other social workers do wrong and letting folks know, like, no, this is not okay. Like, you can't do this. This is harmful to this community. This is harmful to these folks. Oh, no, it's not that important. I learned about this in a class. Well, I'm telling you that class was wrong, or you misinterpreted whatever was being told to you, and this is not okay. Let's address this. So I think a big part of thing that I think we should change in the profession is changing what people see as important, changing as what people see as the grounding areas for these multiple identities that folks carry out throughout their lives. If we can change that, then I think folks will have a better understanding of how to keep up with information, how to look up information, research on their own, ask the right questions, not put too much of a burden on X, Y, and Z people, so that they can do some of this work from a healing, holistic place and not from a bare minimum place.
Go ahead, Eddie.
So one thing that I would change, trigger warning, because it's coming. I think that our profession needs to grow an institutional backbone. I think that the social work profession is weak. I think that we constantly performatively parade around like we are these social activists, that we are these agents for change, when really we're just agents for assimilation. And if we truly were agents for change, then our ethics to hold license, and we know licensing is only for gatekeeping, I'll say that too. So if you don't have your license, it doesn't define you as a social worker. Okay. However, for those who do hold licenses, how is it that you can, in certain states, be legally offered the option to discriminate against people and not lose your license? I don't know. That just happened in Texas, like what, 2 years ago? It's happening in other states as we speak. So I think that it is extremely performative for our profession to constantly say that we are agents for change and champions for advocacy, but most social workers don't even know how to advocate. They get really uncomfortable when they're in the face of needing to say something. They live in states where those states' laws say if you're someone is queer or trans, you don't got to serve them, but they can still hold a license, when other professions at a different caliber or the same caliber as ours know that if you were to do that, to actively discriminate, you are losing your license, you are seeing the board, and you are done. I think that social work at its root is still navigating from the other sides of the tracks model, from the Eurocentric whiteness model, from the cis hetero model. And while there may be a mass exodus of social workers and therapists that are leaving because they're burned out, maybe it's your time to just go anyway. because the guards are changing. The profession is getting blacker, browner, more radical, more indigenous. And a lot of the policies that are in place were never meant for us anyway. So let's grow a backbone, because advocacy doesn't just mean to the agencies that we work with, it's also the agency that's hosting this platform. Our chapter may be more progressive, but we know that NASW, the main chapter, nah, y'all ain't it. ASWB, same thing. Y'all ain't it. That's all.
Drops mic, and I'm gonna mute. Thank you. Sorry. So my computer malfunctioned and shut down, which is why I came and then came back. But one, to Eddie's point, sorry, Mickey, I didn't get to hear the rest of your point, but the education piece definitely seems important and relevant, which I know Anna was mentioning that before it shut down as well. And then Eddie couldn't agree anymore that like social work says we have these values, but in practice, like, what does this look like? What does it actually mean when we say we have these values? And like, just thinking about even the way that we're taught. Like, I don't even remember the last time we were like really taught our code of ethics. We're just kind of told like, oh, these are the few things that are important. Go team. Goodbye. And then, oh, they're like, oh, you have access to the code of ethics. Okay, bye. But it's like, maybe we should actually know these if these are the things that are supposed to be sustaining us and pushing us forward. And also a lot of social work is gatekeeping. Like it's obvious when it's pretty much dominated by really white cis women. And then you wonder why there's a lot of saviorism and stuff involved. It's almost obvious and it's almost embarrassing and like almost exhausting to be told like, no, we're doing good. It's like, but like, it's right there. We're all looking at it. All of us who are like looking at it, we're like, okay, right. So just a fantastic point brought up. One of our other panelists is here. So I wanted a chance to introduce Claire, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself. And then kind of the question that we're on is what you would change about the profession in terms of queer experience. So if you have thoughts on that too, you're welcome to also share on that.
Thank you. Sorry everyone for joining a little late. Yes, my name is Claire Howard. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I identify as a queer Latina, as a queer femme Latina.
Oh, no.
I currently am actually in the process of starting a new position. I've decided to seek out specifically sex positive and queer private practices to kind of greet the intersection of sex positivity, queerness, and of course, anti-racism, which can be covered a little bit under anti-oppressive practice, but primarily under abolitionist practices. So it's a little bit about me. I think it was Eddie that I was just nodding very hard for. I think that the backbone piece in this work is absolutely essential. As someone who I try to remain as active and in a micro stance, even talking to within the community and creating events and finding new places and new folks to kind of bring in to increase accessibility to both the social work services as well as just building community. I think that one of the biggest, and that's something I actually saw today, is there's a lot of, we are in a place where we're in a very big swinging pendulum. On one hand, where, Roe versus Wade is being overturned, and on the other hand, within that same stance, Baltimore is rolling back their laws and saying gay and queer in public spaces and disallowing that. And on the other hand, we're having more and more media around queer-centered stories. And that's incredible. And I love having those conversations. But we are able to have, supposedly we're able to have pride. And I think we'd be remiss if not saying that Pulse had such an incredible, profound impact on the community. It's something I think about every day, as long with all of the other extreme violence that's going on throughout the country. The fact that there were 16 shootings across the country during Memorial Day weekend in different parts, it's wild to me. But again, when we stem this back, we're looking at white supremacy and that being the main villain. And again, when we look back even further, beyond the 1817 Project, we're looking at the fact that white fear was essentially created by cis white men in power. And so when we think about all of that and how that stems, and then how it comes forward today, there's so much to be said. The first thing that comes to mind is that it was created by white men, cis white men. It was created by cis white men to scare others, predominantly white women, cis white women. But again, having the backbone to discuss these matters in all aspects, in all environments, whether that be private practice, mental health agencies, or literally at dinner, is so important. Calling out some of as I started to say today, I went to an event a couple of weeks ago, and there were a couple of influencers, which I dare to say are relatively self-appointed leaders of communities. And I think that's all well and good. By all means, be self-appointed leaders of the community, be iconic. Again, we will talk, there needs to be that continuing conversation about, well, why are the leaders like cis, white, skinny, or white passing? That's a whole other conversation. But if in building platforms such as those and not discussing key matters about what you're doing and what messages you're providing and how that can harm a community, is a giant overstep and oversight in power, and how it can actually harm the community by bridging hate and harm others and alienate others in the community is so, it's so important to discuss. And I think going into this field and knowing that we're all racist, we are all biased, but working against those to make sure that we are not, making sure that we are looking within ourselves to see those areas and those biases and unpacking it, pinpointing where and psychoanalyzing it really is so important, because if we don't, we bring that same harm into the room with us wherever we are whoever we are supporting, whatever community we are supporting. So I think that's something that I'm constantly looking to work on. If you invite me over and we are playing, like I've been in a social space and they're like, let's play a game. I'm like, yeah, let's play a game. Oh, let's play 20 questions. Okay, great. What are your biases and name 5 things that you're doing to reduce them? Because this conversation cannot end outside. They cannot end at graduation. It cannot end anytime soon. And I'm happy to I'm so glad to have the information that I have attained from this higher education, which we all know is a privilege, a huge, huge privilege. But at the same time, it is absolutely our responsibility to to advocate, take a step back, meet folks where they are, and support them. So I know that was a very long-winded response. I thank you, Eddie, for starting that, because it really, your response really resonated with me. So thank you.
Good, Eddie, I see you have your hand up too.
Yeah, but do any of the other panelists want to jump in before I go? I want to make sure that I'm not taking all the space. No? Okay. All right. Trigger warning, it's coming. So thank you, Claire, for bringing up an important thing, which is sex positivity. I have been hyper transparent in the spaces that I'm in that it is because of sex work that I am now a master social worker, that I am licensed, okay? Sex work was the predominant reason why I graduated and paid for my whole tuition in a bag, left and have no student loan debt, okay? And in thinking about us being pro-choice, right? We also need to be pro-sex work. We need to be thinking about these things that intersect, particularly when in the middle of a pandemic, when the world shut down, what was the #1 industry for folks to stay afloat? Virtual sex work. And as I kind of reminisce on being younger and thinking about how were institutions gatekeeping, teaching professionals for their moral compass. Oh, that teacher was buying a wine or a beer, all these pictures, they lose their job, they lose their license, all these things. And now I look back and I think about our profession and we're doing the same thing. Someone in the comments had mentioned earlier about the low salaries for social workers and for therapists. I've seen some professional, therapy jobs for a license being only like 45,000. Who is surviving on that? I recently had a conversation with another licensed therapist, and she's also a stripper. She does both. And actively, we had this conversation around the intersections of therapy that is clinical and even how sex work is often therapeutic for the people that we engage with, right? And while that may be controversial and taboo about boundaries, about transference, about all those things, we have to understand that as more social workers come in, particularly those who are marginalized and queer and trans and Black, sex work is going to be a dominant narrative that we're going to encounter. And if we are so uncomfortable of giving people job opportunities or licenses or revoking licenses because they either have done it or actively continue to do it to support themselves, then we've got, again, another problem. We are so uncomfortable in sex, we are so uncomfortable in people, particularly femme people, having power and ownership of their bodies, that they have no problem using their body as currency, that we would literally stop and remove someone's stability. The things that they worked for. And I think about how, the right is talking about cancel culture and we're on the left, no, we should, we've been canceling people forever institutionally. And we need to understand how we have created a social eugenics of gatekeeping who is allowed and not allowed to make money because they are not, presentable or they don't do and practice in the way that we do. So I definitely give you a tip to you, Claire, because sex work is work. And if you're pro-choice, then you need to be pro-sex work.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it off to Mickey to share thoughts.
Yes, just piggybacking off of some of the thoughts that came along with me is that, what stuck out with me was just meeting people where they're at. We are in a whole new generation of folks who are who are finally willing, ready, understanding of the importance of healing and working through things and finding their own way to a better, happier, healthier, safer life, whatever that looks like. Well, one of the biggest parts of social work is that whole meet people where they're at line. We love to say that. We love to say it all the time. Well, if we're not actually meeting people where they're at, if they're at the place where they need to get their help in this way, which is going to require a social worker who's willing to give that help in that way, well, then we're not meeting them where they're at. We're gatekeeping in another way. We're saying, oh no, you got to get up to this level first, and then I'm gonna give you some help. You got to get over here first, and you got to take care of that stuff on your own. And then when you get here, then I'll be ready to give you some help, because this is my boundary and I'm gonna stay over here. It's like, no, we need social workers in all of these areas. We need social workers who are understanding of, accepting of, leaning into lived experience with all of these dynamics, so that folks could literally get the help where they are at. Because otherwise, it is just one of the many ways that social work as a profession is gatekeeping folks from getting help, from getting support, from getting access to the resources that we have in abundance, and that we've held on to, instead of just dispersing to these folks who, in their own way, are asking for their support, asking for help. Okay.
Mickey, were you done? I couldn't tell because like cut off a little bit for me. So I was like, oh no, like, did I miss something? No, thank you for sharing. Claire, I saw that your hand was up. I didn't know if you wanted to say something.
Yes, I just wanted to add that, like, 1,000,000% wholeheartedly agree that two things. One, that if you're going to be pro-choice, you absolutely have to be pro-sex worker, and pro-sex work, absolutely, and support those folks. And again, the other piece that in the meeting where you are, that Mickey said, I think there's also something else. I attended the alternative sex conference that was run through a Manhattan Alternative, and I've had speakers come into one of the places that I was working previously, and there's a lot of discussion about kinks and talking about kinks and fetishes and sexual preferences and things of that nature. And I think, again, that's another area where we have to be very aware of what we're bringing into the room and where our experiences have led our current perspective. And I know it's very hard to kind of backseat where we're coming from to worry about the transference, but I think that's something that I'm always thinking about. And in one particular conversation, there was discussion around, well, what is the line? Because it seems to be like a revolving door almost of trauma informing or influencing or maybe flagging future fetishes and within sex and being able to talk about that and being able to talk about kinks and preferences when it comes to sex, and again showing up for that, for folks sharing their stories and explaining it, and not necessarily, like he said, he's like, you can't just meet them where they are at a certain point. You have to meet them along the way. And I completely agree. You can't expect to reform or rehabilitate those preferences. And I think that's something that's not, at least in my practices, wasn't discussed enough. And I think that there should definitely be more around that, because we're not there to fix people, so to speak. We're there to facilitate, support, and ask questions and support and meet folks where they need it. I know that sounds very redundant, but I just think that's something that I'm constantly thinking about and trying to add to my practice, and making sure that gets communicated to the folks that I'm seeing, for sure. Because and again, having those discussions, even if it's something that may be difficult for me that's not what we're there to do. we're there for them, for our therapeutic partners. And I think that's so important to remember.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to pass it off to Anna, and then after Anna, we'll open it up for some questions from folks. If folks are thinking of questions, please feel free to send them to me, and then I can read them out loud. And really, that is half for the purpose of, like, if there is a question that maybe folks think is like okay to ask, that might seem like I can view as like that might be traumatic for the queer community, or like to be asked that. I think I want to avoid some of that, or like try to reframe it or reword it. So if you're wondering why, like, I want you to send it directly to me. I want to be very transparent. Like, that's why I think these panelists are important, and I don't want to trigger them, traumatize them, and also other queer folks in the space. So I'll pass off to Anne.
Yeah, well, I think that's great that you brought that up, Rox, because that's kind of what I was thinking about when I was hearing Claire and Mickey talk about meeting clients where they're at. I think that's also something, as we're having this conversation about having intergenerational conversations and, introducing this, newer, like more liberated view of social work that is a very like brand new thing to a lot of social workers who occupy different spaces, that I think they're also like that is also a consideration for like social workers themselves. This idea of meeting people where they're at, and this idea of there being spaces for social workers who are learning to, be met where they're at that specific point in their process without actively traumatizing, queer social workers or Black, Indigenous social workers, disabled social workers, that there are those spaces where social workers can receive that education. And ideally, this should be happening in a classroom. It should be happening, it should be starting from the very beginning. But because, there are spaces like these where people, just have the opportunity to come and listen and maybe be exposed to things that they hadn't considered or hadn't thought, or just things and concepts and ideas that are new to them. But also creating those spaces, and this kind of goes along with that, like as people, especially in areas of privilege, taking on that, sorry, I'm blanking on the word, but that responsibility of like of help guiding, guiding people through that education. Because obviously, like when we have these movements, when we have these educational opportunities, we absolutely need to be creating spaces for for queer people, for Black people, for Black, queer, Indigenous people to be the ones leading these conversations. And at the same time, there is a role that cishet, that white people can play, that able-bodied people can play in coming alongside their fellow white, cishet, able-bodied peers and having those conversations, so that people who are already experiencing that marginalization on a day-to-day basis don't need to bear that burden of beginning of like, okay, like we're explaining what pronouns are. Okay, we're starting from this square, like that other people, and that is a important role of people who occupy areas of privilege, to come alongside and not be the ones leading these movements and conversations, but to come alongside people and maybe they're a little bit further in their education, be like, oh, hey, like here's this great resource that I found from this queer author, or here, like to be the ones to like be like, hey, it's not appropriate to ask people those types of questions, like here you can Google it, or like to just, yeah, to be meeting people where they're at and understanding that like people are going to ask questions that are, you know, not appropriate, that are traumatizing to be asked, and that that is a role that people who occupy those areas of privilege can play by taking on that, so that so that the most marginalized people don't have to bear all of that burden of all of the education.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing those thoughts. And it kind of reminded me of the first question that was posed, but I want to answer a second one. Someone had posed why there were no like older folks on the panel, which I was like, great question. Let's just talk about it transparently. So there actually was more like other people on the panel who like stepped down, came out. So there was, but then like I've had to kind of like rearrange and kind of restructure some of the panel as time has been going, which is not an excuse, because I think also that means they could have like found someone of that capacity or whatever it is. And I think that is just a transparent moment for me of like planning the panel. Like definitely could have found it, definitely could have worked harder, definitely could have asked around. But yeah, so in the thinking there was in the initial, but this is kind of where we landed. In terms of the first question that was asked, someone had asked and stated like they're an elder social worker, they're also queer, and they were saying like, how do you get, or what would be some advice for getting some of the intergenerational like working together and like being more united in that across generations? I don't know if any panelists have any initial thoughts or feelings or reactions, but that was kind of the first question posed.
I'll jump in. I think, and outside of queerness, there is this constant like value of our elders to a certain point and then a disregard, like no matter where it's at. And I think that for me, how I've kind of used my positionality with my youth, while also understanding that cognitively, I am like well beyond my years. This is what I've been told by my elders. Since being young, I've always hung out with the elders. I don't know, I just always found it more fun than being with my peers. And I think that one thing that I try and create when we're looking at that space is within every student, there's a teacher, and within every teacher, there's a student. You know, I think that for a lot of our elders, where young folks get frustrated is we are told, you're young, you don't know, you'll get it when you're older. This is partially true, because I can say a 33-year-old Eddie is not 21-year-old Eddie. That just in that small amount of time, like the things that I've learned, and to a point of that is true. And what is also true is that as we age, we don't stop learning. And the youth hold gems as well. And I think that that is something for us, for our generation, that we need to center in trying to break that generational curse, in that, especially for Black and brown folks, right? Like we have been taught stay in a child's place. If you put your opinion to an elder, you're being disrespectful. If I don't let you disrespect me, then I'm disrespecting you. And I think that these are just some generational curses that we have to transparently break and understand that whenever one of our elders pass, like a library burns down, there's so much knowledge, so much wealth, so much wisdom that is lost. And when I think about our queerness, so much of the history, the things that young folks don't know, like I did not know that even as early as the 80s, queer folks who were like out and about getting arrested by the NYPD, and the NYPD would dress up in these crazy costumes and beat them so that when they reported it, they sounded crazy. I didn't know that, but it was through the connection of my elders who are queer that I got this knowledge. And so I think that on both hands, we both have to understand that one hand washes the other and both wash the face. And we have to do the internal spirit work that, like, our ego is in the way when if we're an elder and somebody younger has information that makes us uncomfortable, that we have to humble ourselves and say, this is a learning moment for me. Let me not limit my growth because I'm older. And then when we're younger, not getting in our feelings because, yeah, we may have been through a lot. And there's so much more to go. And we hope to get to that age. We want to get to that age. So that's for me.
Thank you, Eddie. You bring up good points. And just the difference between like the older generation sometimes and kind of the elements of like ethnicity and like culture that play into it too. That can also kind of interfere with some of the community work that can be done there together. Mickey?
Well, you pretty much summed up the things that I was going to say, Roxy. Yes, along that aspect of, children have to stay in their place. There's also that aspect of like elders are to be respected. And I had multiple youth recently that I was working with come at me with their thoughts, feelings, opinions about not feeling respected by elders. So like, why should I give this respect? Why should I listen to these people if they're talking X, Y, and Z way to me, if they're approaching me in X, Y, and Z way? And I'm not trying to point any fingers by having this this open discussion, but I want to look at things from both sides to make sure that, like, yes, we want the youth to be, and us younger social workers, us younger queer folks, us younger folks to be receptive to all the knowledge and experience that these older folks have. But I also encourage the older folks to be receptive to understanding the younger folks and their perspective and the differences between the generations. And that this is not just like a one-way train of information, but this is a cyclical train. Like there's information to be gained on all parts. And I think there's no end place. As we continue on this journey of growing and learning and progressing of how to better understand each other, I think that that'll be the main factor in helping us to bridge these connections between generations.
Thank you for sharing all of these thoughts, and just again, like kind of trying to get the spectrum of like how each side is kind of seeing it, and even the in between, and like how do we kind of bridge some of that, which I think the person who posed the question was trying to get to that of like there was even like a message that was like received of someone saying like they tried to reach out to the younger generation, like they didn't want to participate, so like what then, like what am I supposed to do, like I wanted them to be a part, I feel open to learning, and like I want to do the work together. So just like posing that as another like element that might be happening is like maybe some of the young generation doesn't want to participate and like wants to do other things, and like might not be as involved according to this person's experience, and it may be other people's experiences as well. So just wanting to pose that as like another element to this. I haven't received any other questions, so if folks have any questions, please feel free to still send them. But I kind of want to go back up to the panel. So does folks have any like final thoughts, final encouragements for other queer folks who are experiencing the system? Just kind of any like last words before we kind of end this chat. Go ahead, Mickey.
My last words would be to, if and when possible, speak up, say something, be heard, whether that is with a shaky voice, whether that is loud and proud, whether that is hiding behind tears, no matter what it is, speak up. I think some of the most profound experiences that I've had as a queer social worker have come from those opportunities where I felt so empowered as to speak up, and a change actually came because of it. Whether it was a small change or a giant change, just the fact that someone was willing to speak up made it so that giant systems, giant organizations, people in really high positions of power were like, oh, I've been saying this for 20 years and no one's ever said anything to me, but here this person is that just joined the team is saying something, so maybe I should rethink something. Oh, great. I did not know that no one said anything for 20 years. I'm glad that I was the one to say something. So yes, and I also say to, when you speak up and say these things, do it from the most flexible place that you can. You're not always going to be completely right. You're not going to have all the answers when people come asking you a bajillion questions of like, oh, you have a problem with this. How do I fix it? Ooh, that's a good question. I have no idea, but let's work on it together. But yes, speak up.
Thank you. Eddie?
I would say, remember who you are. Always remember who you are. In any space you go into, there will be people who will try and change you. There will be people who will try and force you to assimilate into what is appropriate through their lens. And particularly if we're thinking about social work and queerness and, what I would say, all of the industrial complexes that are springing up. Like what are we seeing now with COVID? The industrial mental health complex. Why are there only 20 and 30-minute therapy sessions so that there's a puppy mill of clients being railroaded through while therapists are burning out, while clients are not getting the service that they need? Like, when you are faced with different versions of yourself and the paths that you want to choose, remember who you are and remember that at the end of your decision, there will always be a lesson. So stay empowered in your truth, be radical, remember your why. And it's okay to pivot. Sometimes the people that we are in a certain era of our life will change. And when we do pivot, it's not a failure. There's a gift of failure, right? All the things that I went through, while I would never elect to go through them again, I am the person who I am because of the failures, because of the trauma, because of the pain. And it's up to all of us that while we are holding on to these traumas, remember that all of the healing that we need already exists within us. Particularly for Black and Brown folks, Indigenous folks, that magic lives and exists in our spirit, in our bloodline, in our essence. We know how to heal ourselves. So when you get to a point when you're choosing to either continue gaslighting yourself or choose the discomfort will always lead to a reward.
Thank you, Eddie. Anna?
Yeah, to kind of continue on something that Eddie touched on about just remembering who you are and like remaining strong in your identity, also just with the understanding that, and I mean, this is, I think, for everyone, queer and non-queer folks, is that like identity changes and that, and that people don't, that it doesn't make anyone more or less queer, more or less trans, non-binary. It doesn't make them any less in their identity if they have changed their mind. Because really it's because we have this heteronormative, a metanormative, binary society that kind of says, okay, this is what the norm is. And then if you don't feel like you fit in that norm, you have to now put a label and like know exactly how you don't fit in the norm. That is the only thing that's making us kind of really see it as strange for people to have evolving, for people's identity to evolve and for that to change. And that just because, someone comes out as something one day, it doesn't make, when they're like, actually, I think this is how I identify, it doesn't make that any less valid. And it doesn't make you any less queer. It doesn't make you any less a part of the community, that you are you, and labels are helpful, and labels are also sometimes a harmful socially defined construct that is only necessary because we've decided that they are, and because we've decided that we need to define how people are different from the norm. And so, yeah, I think that is just kind of my closing encouragement, is that you are queer enough.
Thank you, Anna. And then Claire.
I think my final thought is do not be afraid to be creative. We have the MSW, for some folks, the LC, the LM, even further than that. And there's so much that we can do on I think it was Eddie who said this earlier, that unfortunately, like having licensing is, it's like having a very big key to be a gatekeeper. But having licensing kind of unlocks a lot of those areas, but remembering that we can use that privilege to be creative, to create more spaces and options for folks. I think there's a lot of discussion. I mean, I personally received feedback from a practice, and they're like, well, we all had to work in a mental health clinic for a while before we got to work at private practice, so you should have to do the same thing. And again, I respect that perspective. Like, okay, that was your experience. I hear you. I can kind of see the trauma that is prevailing there. But having licensing creates so many opportunities and new ways to interact and provide accessibility to services. And I think that we're told often, like, you either get your LC and you come private practice, or you work for a nonprofit and you do this, that, and the other thing. But remembering that some of the systems that have been built reflect carceral systems. And if we do assimilate and join them, we are continuing that harm. And it's so scary. It could be so scary wandering off into the unknown and being creative and trying new things, because what if it fails? I agree. But what if it doesn't? What if it doesn't? So dare to be creative, dare to try something new, dare to be, and to greet every session or place that you are working at, or start a space to work at and say, like, yes, I am queer, I am femme, I am Latina, like state all of those things, because we know throughout the pandemic, along with sex work, Eddie, so true, that there was a humongous need for therapy. And so we know that we'll never go out. We have our work cut out for us. Folks need support, and coming up with different ways to essentially, I think the goal, my goal is kind of my professional goal is kind of to get folks to a place where they don't need us, so that they can sustain their livelihood on their own. And that makes way for new folks who may not have support to have that. And I think that's the great ongoing cycle. So yes, be creative. Great. Create panels and discussions like this. Thank you so much, Rox. And leave room for others. So be creative.
Thank you, Claire. Be creative. Eddie?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of what you said, Claire, and for anyone who's listening, I am proof that it can be done. Straight out of grad school, I had enough workplace and employment trauma that I physically could not even apply for a job. You want to talk about PTSD manifesting? Anytime I saw Indeed.com, I would start having palpitations. I'd sweat. I couldn't do it. And I knew, I was like, I needed a job. But I decided, all right, what are my legalities? What can I do to get what I want? And I started my own successful private practice straight out of grad school. Got all the things that are needed to meet legally what I have to. And y'all can do it too. We need to break the generational curse that I had to suffer, so you should suffer too, as a way of rite of passage, and I know millennials, my generation, and I'm an older millennial, we are borderline jaded and bitter and liberated and free. And so when we see our, generations coming behind us, part of us are still holding on to that narrative of like, I had to struggle, so you should struggle too. And when you said that, Claire, it gave me a beautiful light bulb. So I thank you for that gift. That the youth are looking to imagine a society where none of us really have to struggle in this way to get to where we need. And that is a beautiful gift. So I thank you for that. Yeah, and y'all can do it. Shoot for the stars. You might combust and turn into dust through the atmosphere as you enter it. But yes, stars, shoot for them.
Thank you, Eddie. And just want to thank all the panelists for sharing your experiences and your stories and what has been meaningful and impactful, and being able to share that with others. And I really do hope that the folks that have a chance to watch now and later, that you really do and felt like you got something out of this. And yeah, I just am extremely grateful for all the speakers, and very glad that all of you kind of came to mind to bring something very different to the talk and the conversation. And yeah, kind of close it out with something that Claire said, which I thought was very amusing, of what are your biases and what are 5 things you're doing to fix them. And on behalf of the chapter, we're happy that you came, and thank you.